The 7th cut was the deepest, just below her left wrist, where the vein ran close and blue, beneath skin so pale it looked like rice paper held to candlelight. Elara pressed her forearm against the bark of the ashwood tree and felt the ancient wood drink from her the way parched earth swallows rain, pulling the blood down through grooves that looked like open mouths frozen mid-scream. The tree had been dying for 3 years. Everyone in the Grey Mist pack knew it, and everyone knew the girl who fed it her blood each night was a fool. But no one stopped her. No one stopped her because no one particularly cared what happened to the pack's herbalist, a wolfless Omega, who slept in the potting shed behind the greenhouse, and whose only value was that she could make a poultice that kept infection from spreading through bite wounds. She was useful in the way a rag is useful. You wring it out and throw it in the corner until you need it again. The night air carried the smell of wet stone and crushed juniper from the mountains above. Elara's knees were muddy. Her dress, a thing she'd stitched together from 2 discarded curtains, clung to her ribs, where the November cold had turned the fabric stiff. She could feel each rib distinctly when she breathed. That was new. She'd been eating less this week, because Maren, the baiter's wife, had locked the pantry after accusing Elara of stealing honey. She hadn't stolen honey. She'd been making a throat compress for Maren's own daughter, who'd had croup for 6 days. But Maren didn't ask. Maren never asked. The tree shuddered beneath her arm. Elara pulled back and watched the bark where her blood had seeped in. It was doing the thing again. The grooves in the wood were shifting, rearranging the way ice crystals form on a window in fast motion. The blood traced paths through the dead bark and left behind something that looked almost like writing, like letters carved by a careful hand. She'd noticed it on the 3rd moon. By the 5th, she'd been sure it was forming a word. Now, on the 7th night, the shape was unmistakable. A name. 5 letters. Cut deep into the grain of a tree that was supposed to be dead. K-A-E-L-S. She had no idea what it meant. She pressed her thumb against the letters and felt warmth push back against her skin, which made no sense because the tree was cold, had been cold for years. Its leaves black and curled its roots, lifting from the ground like the fingers of a corpse. But here where the blood had gone, something was alive. Behind her footsteps on gravel. She yanked her sleeve down and turned too fast, catching her ankle on a root. The stumble sent her sideways into the dirt, and she landed on her hip hard, the jar of comfrey salve in her apron pocket shattering against her thigh. The smell of mint and beeswax bloomed up around her. Dex the Alpha's nephew stood on the path with 2 of his friends. They were 17, a year younger than Elara, and they had that particular cruelty that comes from having never been told no by anyone who mattered. Bleeding on the tree again, Dex said. He had his father's jaw and his mother's contempt. You know it's dead right. You know you're basically performing surgery on a corpse. I'm tending it, Elara said quietly. She didn't stand up. Standing up meant looking at them directly, and looking at them directly meant they'd take longer. Tending it. Dex laughed and glanced at his friends. She tends a dead tree, and she tends to infected wounds, and somehow she still can't tend to washing her own hair. The boys laughed. Elara touched her hair without meaning to. It was tangled, yes. The shed didn't have hot water. My father says Alpha Gregor is going to cut it down next week, Dex said, walking closer. He crouched so he was at her level, and she could smell the roasted elk on his breath. Her stomach tightened. She hadn't eaten since yesterday morning. Says it's an eyesore. Says it attracts weird energy. You know what else attracts weird energy? She said nothing. Wolfless Omegas who play with blood in the middle of the night. He flicked her forehead with his finger. Not hard. just hard enough to make her eyes water. Then he stood, brushed his knees, and walked away with his friends, their laughter scattering into the pines like startled birds. Ilara sat in the dirt for a long time after they left. She looked at the broken jar in her apron, the salve mixing with mud, 4 hours of work ruined. She looked at her wrist where the cut was still seeping. She looked at the tree. The letters were glowing, faintly barely the way embers glow just before they die. K-A-E-L-S. She didn't know that name. She didn't know that in 3 days she wouldn't need to. The delegation arrived on a Thursday, which was unusual, because delegations usually arrived on the first day of the moon cycle, which was protocol, which was tradition, which was how things were done. But the Alpha King of the Ironmore Dominion did not appear to care much about how things were done. Ilara heard them before she saw them. She was in the greenhouse, grinding dried yarrow with a mortar that had a chip in the rim that always cut her palm if she wasn't careful. The sound came through the foggy glass. Vehicles. Not the old trucks the grey mist pack used, but something heavier. Something that made the ground vibrate through the concrete floor and up through the soles of her bare feet. She wiped her hands on her apron and peered through the glass. 3 black vehicles, the kind with tinted windows and reinforced frames, had pulled into the main courtyard. Pack members were already gathering, pulling on jackets, smoothing hair, adjusting postures. She watched Alpha Gregor step out of the main lodge. He was a small man who compensated with volume, and even from here she could see him tugging his vest down over his belly, arranging his face into something meant to look authoritative, but landing closer to constipated. The door of the middle vehicle opened. The man who stepped out made the courtyard feel smaller. He was tall in the way mountains are tall, not just height, but mass, the kind of body that looked like it had been built by decades of fighting rather than exercise. Dark hair cut short, a jaw that could have been carved from the same stone as the mountains above the valley. He wore black, simple, no insignia, no gold, nothing that announced his rank, which was itself an announcement, because only someone whose power was absolute could afford to look ordinary. A scar ran from his left temple to the corner of his mouth, thin and white, like a river drawn on a map. But it was his eyes that made Ilara's hand stop moving on the mortar. They were amber, not brown, not hazel. Amber, the color of pine resin held to firelight, and even from 40 yards away through dirty greenhouse glass, she felt those eyes sweep the courtyard like a searchlight. Her wolf, the one she didn't have, the one that had never manifested, the one whose absence was the reason she slept in a shed and ate scraps and bled for a dying tree. Her wolf did something it had never done before. It stirred, not fully, not the way she'd heard other wolves described the surge of power, the heat, the sense of another consciousness unfurling inside your chest. This was smaller, a flutter, like a moth trapped between window panes. A tremor in a place inside her ribs that had been silent for 18 years. She dropped the mortar. It cracked on the floor. Yarrow dust puffed up around her feet. Through the glass, the man in black turned his head. Slowly, precisely, as if he'd heard the mortar crack from 40 yards away through walls and glass, and the murmur of 30 pack members. He was looking at the greenhouse. He was looking at her. Ilara stepped back from the window so fast she knocked over the drying rack. Bundles of sage and calendula scattered across the floor. Her heart was doing something strange, beating in a rhythm she didn't recognize, too fast and too deep, like a drum played by someone who knew a song she'd never heard, but somehow already knew the words too. She pressed her back against the potting bench and breathed. In through her nose. Wet earth, fertilizer, the chalky smell of dried roots, and something else, something that wasn't in the greenhouse, something that had no business being in the greenhouse. Wood smoke and iron and something sweet beneath it, like the sap that bleeds from pine trees when you cut them in spring, that golden sticky sweetness that tastes like the forest, is offering you something precious. The greenhouse door opened. Not gently. Not with the careful, apologetic way most people opened this door, knowing it stuck at the bottom and needed to be lifted slightly on its hinges. This door opened as if the person opening it had never met a door that gave him trouble. He filled the frame. Up close, the Alpha King of the Ironmore Dominion was worse than he'd been at 40 yards. His presence was a physical thing. A pressure changed the way the air feels different right before a thunderstorm cracks. His amber eyes found her immediately in the dim corner behind the potting bench where she'd been trying to make herself small, and something in those eyes shifted. The cold, scanning alertness became something else. Something she couldn't name. Something hungry. "Out," he said. For a confused moment, she thought he was talking to her. Then she realized 2 of his guards had followed him in, and they looked at each other, looked at him, and left without a word. The door closed. They were alone. He took a step toward her. She could see the scar better now, a thin crescent from temple to mouth. She could see the way his hands, enormous, scarred across the knuckles, hung at his sides, with a stillness that suggested the effort of restraint. "What is your name?" His voice was low. Not quiet. Low. The difference was that quiet is a choice, and low is a frequency, something that vibrated in the floorboards and in the metal legs of the potting bench and somewhere behind her sternum. Elara. She was surprised her voice worked. "I'm the herbalist." Elara. He said it like he was tasting it. His nostrils flared slightly, and she watched his pupils dilate the amber irises, shrinking to thin rings around black pools. "You smell like yarrow and blood." She looked down at her hands. The mortar chip had caught her palm again. A thin line of red ran between her fingers, dripping onto the concrete. He crossed the greenhouse in 3 strides and took her hand. She should have flinched. She should have pulled away. She should have done any of the things that a wolfless Omega does when the most powerful Alpha on the continent grabs her bleeding hand in a greenhouse that smells like dirt and crushed herbs. But the moment his skin touched hers, the moth behind her ribs became a bird, and the bird was trying to break through bone to reach him. He was staring at her palm, at the blood, at the thin, pale scars beneath the fresh cut, dozens of them layered like the rings of a tree. His jaw tightened. The muscle in his cheek flexed and released and flexed again. "Who did this to you?" "No one. I cut myself on the mortar. I do it all the time. The rim is chipped." "Not this." He turned her hand over, then pushed her sleeve up before she could stop him. He saw the cuts, the 7 cuts evenly spaced, still healing the ones she'd made for the tree. His eyes came up from her arm to her face, and she saw something in them that she hadn't expected. Not pity, not disgust. Rage. Pure and precise, and controlled the way a blade is controlled. These are deliberate. It's not what you think. Tell me what I think. She swallowed. You think someone is hurting me. No one is hurting me. I'm feeding the ashwood, the sacred tree. It's dying and I'm trying to save it. He didn't let go of her hand. His thumb traced the edge of the most recent cut featherlight, and she shivered. Not from cold, from the warmth that spread from his touch, up her arm and into her chest, dissolving something tight that had been there so long she'd forgotten it wasn't supposed to be there. "The sacred tree," he repeated. "Your pack has a sacred ashwood. It's dying. It's been dying for 3 years. I'm the only one who still tends it." His expression did something complicated. "Show me." She should have said no. She should have told him Alpha Gregor would want to greet him properly, that there were protocols, that she was no one, that she didn't have the authority to take the Alpha King anywhere. But his hand was still holding hers, and the bird behind her ribs was singing now, actually singing a high, thin note, like a crystal glass, struck with a fingernail, and she couldn't think of a single reason to say no, that her body would agree with. "It's this way," she said. She led him out the back of the greenhouse, through the herb garden, where the late autumn rosemary was still clinging to life, along the stone path that wound behind the main lodge, and into the copse of old-growth trees where the ashwood stood. The whole way he kept his hand on the small of her back, not pushing, just there, a point of contact that burned through the curtain fabric of her dress like a coal. When they reached the tree, he stopped. She stopped too and watched his face. Most people who saw the ashwood for the first time looked at it with something like sadness, the way you look at anything grand that has been ruined. The tree was massive, easily the largest in the territory, its trunk wide enough that 4 wolves couldn't circle it with their arms. But its bark was grey and cracked. Its branches were bare. Its roots had lifted from the earth, in places arching up like the ribs of a whale skeleton half buried in sand. But where Elara had bled, it was different. The man she didn't yet know to call Kyles stepped forward and placed his palm flat against the trunk. He went very still. She saw his shoulders tense, then release, then tense again. "Come here," he said. She came to stand beside him. He took her hand, the bleeding one, and pressed it gently against the bark beside his own. The warmth was immediate. It surged through the wood and into her palm and up her arm, and she gasped because it felt like the tree was reaching for her, like roots were growing inside her veins, like her blood was being pulled not away from her but toward something. The bark shifted. New grooves formed. The letters she'd seen before, Kaels, deepened and spread, and new ones appeared, and for the first time she could read the full inscription. The tree wrote in the old language, the one they used for bonding ceremonies and death rites and the naming of wolves. Kale's son of iron, bound to the blood keeper. "That's your name," Elara whispered. "That's been your name. For 7 moons, that's what the tree has been writing." He looked at her, and his eyes were no longer amber. They were gold. Pure liquid gold, the color of a wolf's eyes in the half-second before the shift. "You have been feeding this tree your blood for 7 moons, he said. "And the tree has been writing my name. I didn't know. The tree did." His voice had changed. It was rougher now, deeper, as if something inside him was pressing against the walls of his human shape. "The tree knew before either of us did. You are mine, and I am late." The chaos started 20 minutes later, when Alpha Gregor realized his distinguished guest was not in the courtyard, accepting ceremonial wine, but was standing in a dying copse with his wolfless Omega herbalist, holding her hand with eyes that had gone full wolf gold. Elara had been trying to extract her hand from Kales's grip, not because she wanted to, because she could hear voices approaching, and she knew with the bone-deep certainty of someone who has spent 18 years being punished for existing that this would go badly. "Please," she said. "Your Majesty, you need to let go. Alpha Gregor will be furious. I outrank him. Yes, but I don't." That stopped him. He looked at her, and something flickered across his face, a recalibration, and she realized that for all his power, it had not immediately occurred to him that his protection could make things worse for her. That the moment he left, she would still be here. "I'm not leaving," he said. "You have to. I'm not leaving without you. You don't even know me. I know enough. He released her hand, but stepped closer, so close she could feel the heat radiating from his chest. He smelled like wood smoke and iron and pine sap and something beneath all of it that was just him, just his skin, and it made her dizzy. I know you've been starving. I can count your ribs through your dress. I know you sleep somewhere cold. Your lips are blue, and your fingertips are rough and cracked in a way that only happens from prolonged cold exposure. I know no one has touched you with kindness in a very long time because you flinched when I took your hand, but leaned into it within 3 seconds. And I know this tree, which has been dead to everyone else, is alive where you've been bleeding. His hand came up, and he tucked a strand of her tangled hair behind her ear. The gesture was so gentle compared to the size of his hand that her eyes burned. I don't have a wolf, she said. She said it like a confession, like the final piece of evidence in a case for why he should walk away. You do, he said simply. I can feel her. She's been sleeping. She's waking up. The moth behind her ribs fluttered hard. The bird. Whatever it was. Alpha Gregor burst through the tree line with 6-pack warriors, and Dex trailing behind, looking like a boy who'd been caught breaking something and was hoping to deflect blame. Your Majesty. Gregor's face was the color of a beet. I apologize for the inconvenience. I see you've wandered off the path. This is our Omega herbalist. She's no one of importance, and I would be honored to escort you to the lodge for the official welcome. Kales did not look at Gregor. He was still looking at Ilara. When he finally turned, he did it slowly, the way a wolf turns to assess something that has interrupted its meal. She is your herbalist. Yes, Your Majesty. She is starving. Gregor's mouth opened and closed. She eats with the rest of the pack. She does not. She is 15 pounds underweight, and her hands suggest she has been without adequate shelter for months. She has untreated lacerations on her forearms and a bruise on her forehead that is approximately 12 hours old. Kales's voice had not risen. It was still low, still level, still vibrating in that register that made the air feel different. Why does your herbalist have a 12-hour-old bruise on her forehead? Dex behind his uncle went white. Gregor stammered. I wouldn't know, Your Majesty. She's clumsy. The girl is always falling. She's not clumsy. She's weak from hunger. People who are weak from hunger fall, and people who fall into fingers leave oval bruises, not the circular ones you get from rocks and floors. The silence that followed was the loudest thing Ilara had ever heard. Kales turned back to her. His voice changed entirely. The low frequency was still there, but it had shifted from cold precision to something warm, something careful, the way you speak to an animal that has been trapped. Ilara, I am the Alpha King of the Ironmore Dominion. My name is Kales Voidfang, and this tree has been writing it in your blood for 7 moons. And I do not believe in coincidence. I believe in the bond. Will you come with me? She looked at him. She looked at Gregor, whose face had gone from beet red to ash grey. She looked at Dex, who was studying his shoes. She looked at the tree behind her, the ancient dying ashwood that had swallowed her blood and turned it into a name. The bird behind her ribs opened its wings. Yes, she said. The Ironmore Dominion was 300 miles north in the mountains, where the air tasted like copper and snow, and the pines grew so tall their tops disappeared into the clouds. The capital was a fortress city called Thornhall, and the Alpha King's residence was at its center, a structure built from black stone and old timber that managed to be both brutally imposing and unexpectedly warm inside the way A wolf's den is warm, all firelight and fur and the smell of cedar. Elara sat in the back of the vehicle for the entire drive, with a wool blanket around her shoulders that Kales had produced from somewhere eating dried venison and oatcakes that his beta, a woman named Ceres, with close-cropped silver hair and steady grey eyes, had handed her without comment. Kyle sat beside her but did not touch her again. He seemed to understand in a way that surprised her that his touch had been overwhelming and that she needed time to absorb the fact that her entire life had changed between one heartbeat and the next. He spoke to Ceres in low tones about the territory and border disputes and supply chains, and Elara listened and ate and watched the landscape change through the window. The forests got denser, the mountains got higher, the road narrowed, and then widened again as they passed through gates and checkpoints, where uniformed wolves saluted with a fist to the chest and stared at her with open curiosity. At Thornhall she was given a room. Not a shed, not a corner. A room. It had a bed with actual sheets and a wool coverlet dyed deep green. It had a window that looked out over the inner courtyard, where a fountain carved to look like a wolf's head spat water into a stone basin. It had a fireplace already lit, the logs crackling with the particular sound of dry oak that has been stored properly. There was a wardrobe with clothes in it. Not fine clothes, not court gowns, but sturdy wool dresses and thick stockings, and a pair of boots that looked like they'd been sized for her, which was impossible because no one had measured her feet. "I asked Gregor's tailor for your measurements before we left," Kales said from the doorway. He was leaning against the frame with his arms crossed, watching her touch the boots with the tentative reverence of someone handling a holy relic. "He didn't have them. He's never made you anything. So I estimated from your shoe size and wrist circumference." "You measured my wrist when I held your hand. I measure everything. It's a habit." She looked at him, this enormous man with amber eyes and a scar like a crescent moon, leaning in a doorway and telling her he'd memorized her wrist circumference in a greenhouse 45 minutes after meeting her. "This is too much," she said. "It is the minimum. I can't repay any of this. You bled for a tree for 7 moons. You don't know what repayment means." He pushed off the doorframe. "Dinner is at 7. You can eat here or in the hall. No one will force you either way. If anyone in this pack gives you trouble, you tell Ceres. If Ceres is unavailable, you tell me. I will be available." He paused. She could see the effort it took him to step back instead of forward. "I know this is fast," he said. "I know you have no reason to trust me. But the bond is real, and the tree knew it before either of us did. And I have been waiting for you for 31 years, and I can wait longer if I need to. But I will not let you be hungry again." He closed the door. Elara sat on the edge of the bed, her fingers still curled around one of the boots, and cried. Not the thin, silent crying she did in the potting shed. Real crying. The kind that comes from the sudden absence of a weight you didn't know you were carrying because you'd been carrying it so long it felt like your own skeleton. She tried to leave on the 3rd day, not because she was unhappy, because she was terrified of being happy. The logic was simple. She'd learned it the way you learn that fire burns through repeated contact. Good things ended. Good things were traps. The nicer a situation seemed, the worse the eventual withdrawal. She'd been fed 3 meals a day for 3 days, given her own room, treated with a politeness that ranged from neutral to cautiously warm by the Ironmore pack members. Ceres had shown her the pack's medicinal stores, which were extensive and well-organized, but lacked someone who understood herb interactions, and had casually mentioned that they'd been looking for an herbalist for 2 years. It was too perfect. It was a snare with soft jaws. So on the third morning before dawn, she packed the dried venison and oatcakes she'd been saving into the pockets of her new coat and slipped out through the service corridor behind the kitchen. She made it to the outer wall. Kyles was sitting on the wall, not pacing, not scanning the darkness with his wolf senses. Sitting, on the stone ledge beside the eastern gate legs, hanging over the side, eating an apple as if he'd been waiting for her the way you wait for a bus. "The eastern road is faster," he said, taking a bite, "but the southern road is safer, less wolf traffic after midnight." She stopped. "How did you know?" "Because I would have left on the third day, too." He finished the apple and tossed the core into the darkness. "I grew up in a pack that used kindness as currency. If someone was nice to you, they wanted something. If they wanted something, you'd pay for it eventually. It took me 11 years and a war to learn that some people are just decent." He looked at her. In the pre-dawn dark, his eyes were more wolf than human, catching the faint light from the guard tower and reflecting it back. "You can leave. That gate is not locked, and I will not stop you. But you should know 2 things first." "What 2 things?" "The ashwood tree at Greymist is dead. It died the night you left. Gregor's scouts sent word yesterday. The entire trunk split and fell. Every root turned to powder." She felt something lurch in her chest. The tree. Her tree. "What's the second thing?" "The courtyard fountain has been growing bark since yesterday morning. My groundskeeper is quite upset." He jumped down from the wall. His boots hit the flagstones with a sound like a judge's gavel. "Whatever you are, Elara, whatever your blood does, it followed you here. The ashwood didn't die because you left. It died because it finished its purpose. It brought you to me. And now something new is growing." He walked past her back toward the main residence and stopped. "Third day is always the hardest. 4th day is better. Stay for the 4th day. If you still want to leave on the 5th, I'll drive you myself." He didn't look back. She stood at the gate for a long time. The hinges were oiled. The path beyond it was clear. The southern road stretched into the pines, pale in the early light. She turned around and went back inside. The 4th day was better. He'd been right about that. On the 4th day, Ceres took her to see the fountain. The wolf-head spout was no longer visible. Where polished stone had been, there was now a sheath of living bark, pale green and smooth, and from it thin tendrils of wood were reaching outward, curling around the rim of the basin. Small leaves, the kind that only grow on ashwood saplings, had sprouted along the tendrils. The water still flowed, but it flowed through channels in the bark now, as if the tree and the fountain had negotiated a partnership. "He's pretending it's not alarming," Ceres said, standing beside Elara with her hands in her pockets. "But I've known him for 15 years, and I've never seen him pretend this hard." "Is he angry?" Ceres looked at her. "He woke up at 4 in the morning to sit on a wall and wait for you to run. He estimated your wrist circumference from a single handhold. He threatened to dismantle the Greymist pack charter over a bruise. He is not angry. He is terrified." "Of what?" "Of you leaving. Of you staying. Of whatever you are and what it means." Ceres shrugged. "Same things you're terrified of, just from the other side." Elara touched the bark on the fountain. It was warm. The same warmth she'd felt in the ashwood when she bled for it. The same warmth she felt when Kales touched her hand. "Ceres, do you know what a blood keeper is?" The beta went still. Her grey eyes sharpened. "Where did you hear that term? The tree, at Greymist, before it died. It wrote something in the old language. It said, 'Bound to the blood keeper.'" Ceres was quiet for a long time. When she spoke, her voice was different. Careful. Bloodkeepers are a myth, or they were. The old texts describe them as wolves whose blood carries the memory of the land. They can wake dormant things, heal dying forests, grow wards from living wood. The last confirmed Bloodkeeper was 400 years ago. She bonded with the first Alpha King of the Ironmoor Dominion and grew the Thorn Wall that still protects the northern border. Thorn Wall. The one you drove through to get here. The one everyone assumes is just an old hedge. It's 112 feet tall, and it has thorns the size of your forearm, and nothing has breached it in 4 centuries. A woman grew it with her blood. Ilara looked at her hands, the scars, the cuts, the thin lines layered like tree rings. "I don't have a wolf," she said. Ceres tilted her head. "You don't have a wolf the way a seed doesn't have a tree. The tree is there. It just hasn't broken through yet." That night, Ilara went to the fountain alone. She sat on the edge of the basin where the bark was spreading, and she did what she'd done at the Ashwood for 7 moons. She cut a small line on her inner forearm and pressed it against the living wood. The response was immediate. The bark surged outward. New branches pushed through the stone courtyard. Roots cracked the flagstones and dove into the earth beneath. Leaves unfurled in the moonlight, pale and silver green, and the air filled with a scent she recognized, but couldn't name, something ancient and sweet and alive. And inside her chest, the bird that had been fluttering and singing for days suddenly went quiet. It went quiet because it was no longer a bird. It was a wolf. And it was breathing. Kales found her in the courtyard at midnight, standing in the center of what was now undeniably a small forest growing out of his fountain. He stood at the edge of the new growth and looked at the trees, at the roots threading through the stone, at the girl standing in the center of it, with blood on her arm and moonlight in her tangled hair. And he said nothing for a very long time. "Your groundskeeper is going to be more than upset," Ilara said. He laughed. The sound was unexpected, rough and warm, and it cracked something open between them. He walked into the grove of new trees, ducking under a branch that had grown at precisely the height to catch a man of his size, and stopped in front of her. "What do you feel?" he asked. "A wolf," she whispered. "I feel a wolf." His eyes flared gold. Not the controlled, deliberate gold of an alpha exercising power. This was involuntary, raw. "She's there. She's been sleeping. Since I was born, she's been sleeping. I thought she didn't exist. Everyone told me she didn't exist. They were wrong. She wakes up when I bleed for the trees. She wakes up when you're near." He raised his hand and held it in the space between them, palm up, an offering rather than a demand. "Then let me be near." She placed her hand in his. The wolf inside her opened its eyes. The world shifted. Colors became sharper. Sound separated into layers. The wind, the water, the rustle of new leaves. His heartbeat steady and strong, and faster than she expected. Fast, because of her fast. Because a 31-year-old Alpha King was standing in a forest that had grown from his fountain and holding the hand of a girl whose blood could wake the earth, and his heart was pounding because he was afraid this would end. "I can hear your heart," she said. "I know. Can you feel the bond?" She could. It was like a root. It was exactly like a root. Growing from somewhere deep in her chest, reaching through the space between them, threading into him. Not a chain, not a leash. A root. Something that grew because the soil was right. "Yes," she said. He pulled her closer, slowly giving her time to resist, and when she didn't, he pressed his forehead against hers. His skin was warm. His breath smelled like mint tea and wood smoke. "You grew a forest in my courtyard," he said against her skin. "Sorry. Don't be sorry. Grow it bigger. Grow it over the whole damn fortress. I don't care." She laughed. It was the first time she'd laughed in longer than she could remember, and the sound startled her like finding a room in your house you'd forgotten was there. He kissed her forehead. Just her forehead. A press of lips against skin, and her wolf surged, and the trees around them grew an inch, and somewhere in the fortress a guard shouted in alarm as a root broke through the kitchen floor. "We're going to have to talk about property damage," Kyles murmured. "Later." "Later," he agreed. Maren arrived on the 9th day. Not Maren alone. Maren Alpha, Gregor Dex, and 6 grey mist warriors rolling into Thorn Hall in their rusting trucks with their moth-eaten ceremonial banners, looking like a community theatre troupe that had accidentally wandered onto the set of a war film. Ilara was in the new grove, which now covered half the courtyard, and had begun sending tendrils up the walls of the main residence when Ceres came to find her. "Grey Mist delegation at the gates," Ceres said. "They're demanding your return." "My return?" "Gregor claims you were abducted. He's invoking territorial covenant. He says you're pack property." Ilara's stomach turned. Not from fear, though there was fear. From the word. Property. She found Kyles in the great hall. He was standing behind the long table where he took meetings, his hands flat on the dark wood, and when she entered, he looked up. And she saw the wolf in his eyes, very close to the surface. Pacing. "They can't have you," he said. "It was not a question." "I know. They're calling you property. I know. I want to tear Gregor apart and use his spine as a coat rack. I know. Don't." His jaw flexed. The muscle in his cheek did its rhythmic tightening. She crossed the hall and stood on the other side of the table facing him. "Let them in," she said. "Why?" "Because I need to see them. Not as the girl who slept in the shed. As this. As whatever I am now." He studied her. Then he straightened and nodded to Ceres, who opened the main doors. The Grey Mist delegation entered like they were walking into their own execution chamber, which, depending on how the next few minutes went, they might have been. Gregor had rehearsed. She could tell by the way he planted his feet and lifted his chin the way a man does when he's about to deliver words he's been practicing in the car for 300 miles. "Alpha King," Gregor began, "we come in peace and with respect for the ancient covenants. We seek the return of Ilara, our pack herbalist, who was taken from our territory without proper transfer protocols." "Without proper transfer protocols," Kyles repeated. "Yes, Your Majesty." "Interesting phrasing. As I recall, your pack kept her in a garden, shed-fed her scraps, denied her medical care, and allowed your nephew to bruise her face. But the issue is transfer protocols." Gregor's rehearsed posture crumbled slightly. Behind him, Dex was staring at the floor. "With respect, Your Majesty, internal pack discipline is a sovereign matter." "Discipline?" Kyles came around the table. He moved the way wolves move, fluid and inevitable. She was not a wolf being disciplined. She was a blood keeper being starved. The room went very quiet. Maren, who had been standing behind her husband with the particular expression of a woman who has something to say and is choosing her moment, stepped forward. "A blood keeper," Maren said. Her voice was flat. "That's impossible. She's wolfless. She's nothing." "She grew a forest from a stone fountain in 4 days," Ceres said from the doorway. "With her blood, the same blood she was using to keep your sacred tree alive for 3 years while you did nothing." Maren turned to look at Ilara, and Ilara looked back. This was the woman who had locked the pantry, who had let her daughter cough for 6 days before Ilara made the compress, who had never once said thank you or acknowledged that the wolfless omega in the shed was the reason her child could breathe. But here is the thing Ilara saw in Maren's eyes that she had not expected. Recognition, not the kind that comes from suddenly seeing someone's worth, the kind that comes from having always seen it and having chosen deliberately day after day to look away. Maren's eyes flickered, and in that flicker, Ilara saw exhaustion, and something that might have been shame, buried so deep it had calcified into cruelty, because cruelty was easier than admitting you had failed to protect someone who depended on you. Maren looked away first. "We didn't know what she was," Maren said quietly, "to the floor, to no one." "You knew she was hungry," Ilara said. It was the first time she'd spoken to any of them since arriving. Maren flinched. It was small, barely visible, but it was there, and Ilara felt no satisfaction, from it only a tired kind of clarity. Cale stepped between them, not protectively, definitively. "Here is what will happen. Ilara is my fated mate, and she remains in Ironmoor under my protection, by her own choice. Your sacred ashwood is dead because you neglected it, and the keeper who sustained it. The territorial covenant does not apply, because Ilara was never registered as a full pack member. She was registered as seasonal labor. I checked." Gregor went white. "You registered your blood keeper as seasonal labor," Cale said, and the quiet fury in his voice made the candle flames on the table shudder. "You classified her the same as a migrant fence builder. You are going to leave this hall. You are going to return to your territory. And you are going to govern your pack with the knowledge that you had the most precious gift the moon goddess ever granted, sleeping in a shed behind your greenhouse, bleeding herself dry to save a tree you were planning to cut down for firewood." He leaned closer to Gregor, close enough that the smaller alpha had to tilt his head back to maintain eye contact. "And if you ever come to my territory again for any reason without an invitation written on paper, I can see and signed with ink I can smell, I will dissolve your pack charter and absorb your lands into the Ironmoor Dominion. Do you understand?" Gregor nodded. It was not a dignified nod. The Grey Mist delegation left Thornhall 17 minutes after they arrived. Their trucks coughed and rattled down the southern road, and Ilara watched them go from the window of the great hall, and she did not feel triumph. She felt tired. She felt the particular kind of tired that comes from finally putting down something heavy that you've been holding for so long, your arms forgot they were holding anything. Cale stood behind her. "You didn't tear him apart," she said. "You asked me not to." The coat rack line was good, though. "Thank you. I've been saving it." She leaned back, just slightly, just enough that her shoulder blades touched his chest. He stayed perfectly still, letting her set the pressure, letting her decide how much of his warmth she wanted. She wanted all of it. On the 14th night, the wolf broke through. It happened in the grove. Of course it happened in the grove. The trees had grown tall enough now that their canopy blocked the sky, and the moonlight filtered through the leaves in shifting patterns that moved like breathing. The fountain was gone, entirely consumed by the central tree, which had grown a trunk as wide as a man's arm span and bark the color of fresh honey. Ilara had been cutting less. The trees grew on their own, now fed by the roots that threaded through the earth of the entire courtyard, drawing from water and soil instead of blood. But she still came here at night, still sat among the roots, still felt the pulse of the wood against her skin. She was sitting with her back against the central trunk when the pain started. It began in her chest. Not her heart. Deeper, the place where the bird had been, where the wolf had been breathing, where something had been growing for 14 days, fed by the bond, fed by the trees, fed by the slow, careful warmth of a man who measured wrist circumferences and sat on walls at 4 in the morning and kissed foreheads and waited. The pain spread through her ribs, down her spine, into her hips and her thighs and her hands. Her fingers curled against the bark, and she heard herself make a sound low and raw, and the trees responded. Every leaf turned toward her. Every branch bent inward. She heard running footsteps. Cales burst through the grove, bare-chested barefoot, his eyes fully gold, and dropped to his knees beside her. "It's happening," he said. "It hurts." "I know. I know it hurts. Stay with me. Look at me." She looked at him, through the pain, through the tearing sensation in her chest, through the feeling of something massive and ancient pushing through a door that had been sealed for 18 years. She looked at him, and his eyes were the only steady thing in a world that was fracturing. "There you are," he whispered. "Come out. Come out, we're here." Her wolf emerged, not slowly, not gently, with the force of a river breaking through a dam that should never have been built. Her wolf surged through her and out of her, and the shift took her in one convulsive wave, and she was 4 legs and silver fur, and a howl that shattered every window in the eastern wing of the fortress. She was enormous, not the small, delicate wolf of an omega. She was nearly as large as Cales's own wolf form, with fur the color of birch bark, white and silver, and eyes that glowed green, vivid and bright, the color of new leaves, the color of the ashwood grove. She stood in the grove on trembling legs, and the trees bowed to her. Actually bowed. Their branches dipped down, and their leaves brushed her fur, and roots lifted from the earth to curl around her paws, and the grove hummed with a frequency that she could feel in every cell of her transformed body. Cales shifted. His wolf was black, pure black, massive, with amber eyes that caught the moonlight and threw it back. He was larger than her, but not by much, and when he approached, he did it low, head down, not submissive, but careful, the way an equal approaches an equal. He pressed his muzzle against her neck. She felt the vibration of his growl, low and constant, the wolf equivalent of the purring a mate makes when they find their other half. She pressed back. They ran. Through the grove, out the eastern gate that some bleary-eyed guard had left open into the mountains through the pines that smelled like cold resin and wet earth under a moon that hung low and heavy and full. She ran, and her paws barely touched the ground, because her wolf was not an ordinary wolf. Her wolf was something that had been sleeping for 18 years in a girl who bled for dying trees, and now it was awake, and it was fast, and it was wild, and the forest opened for it, like the trees were pulling aside to let her pass. They ran for hours, and when they stopped panting on a ridge overlooking the valley where Thornhall sat glittering like an ember in the dark, Cales shifted back first, and she followed, and they were human again, breathless and shaking and covered in pine needles and sweat. "Your wolf is silver," he said, grinning. She had never seen him grin. It transformed his face. The scar, the hard jaw, the intimidating architecture of his features, all of it softened into something that was almost boyish. Silver, like the old bloodline, like the first blood keeper. "I howled so loud I broke your windows. I have a lot of windows. They'll fix them." She was shivering, not from cold, from the aftershock of the shift, the raw newness of it, the strangeness of having been 2 things at once for the first time in her life. He pulled her against his chest and wrapped his arms around her, and she pressed her face into his neck and breathed him in. Wood smoke, iron, pine sap. Him. Elara. Mom, I would like to mark you. Not now, not tonight, but soon, when you're ready. Will you be ready? She pulled back and looked at him. His eyes were amber again, human, but the wolf was still there, right at the edge, watching her with the same hunger and the same restraint. Ask me on the 4th day, she said. He blinked. Then he laughed, and the sound echoed off the mountain and scattered into the pines. The 4th day after her first shift was a Tuesday. Cales asked. She said yes. But first the war came. Not a war exactly. A challenge. Alpha Corvain of the Duskfang pack, whose territory bordered Ironmoor to the west, had been waiting for an excuse to test Cales's defenses for years. The arrival of a blood keeper, the first in 4 centuries, was not an excuse. It was an invitation. Corvain wanted Elara, not as a mate, as a weapon. The message arrived by courier wolf, a grey-fawed male who crossed the border at dawn and shifted at the gates, gasping with a scroll case strapped to his thigh. Cales read the message in his study, with Ceres at his side, and Elara standing by the window, watching the grove, which had begun sending roots under the fortress walls and into the surrounding forest. He's invoked the Dominion Challenge, Cales said. Single combat for contested resources. He's calling her a resource, Ceres said. He's calling her unclaimed. The marking hasn't happened yet. Technically, she's an independent wolf on Ironmoor territory, without formal bond documentation. Any alpha can challenge for claim rights. Elara turned from the window. What happens in single combat? 2 alphas fight. Winner takes the contested resource. Cales folded the message with precise mechanical movements. Corvain is a butcher. He doesn't fight to win. He fights to disassemble. You can beat him. Probably. But if I lose, he takes you, and I won't do anything that puts you at risk. Then mark me now, before the challenge. The challenge is at dawn tomorrow. A marking takes root over 3 days. He'd contest it as coerced. Ceres crossed her arms. There is another option. They both looked at her. The old laws allow a blood keeper to designate her own alpha. It's not a mate bond claim. It's a sovereignty declaration. She declares herself bound to the land, not the alpha, and the alpha is her guardian, by virtue of ruling that land. Corvain can't challenge for a land-bound keeper without declaring war on the territory itself. That's a 400-year-old statute, Cales said. No one's used it, because no one's had a blood keeper in 400 years. Cales looked at Elara. She saw the war in his expression, the alpha who wanted to fight to tear Corvain apart in front of both packs and claim her by conquest and be done with it, versus the man who had sat on a wall at 4 in the morning because he understood what it was like to be someone else's property. It's your choice, he said. I will fight Corvain, or you can invoke the old law. I will do whatever you decide. If you fight and win, Elara said slowly, what happens to Corvain's pack? They submit or they scatter, standard conquest terms. How many wolves in Duskfang? About 300, families, pups. Then I invoke the old law. Cales exhaled. She watched his shoulders drop just slightly and realized he'd been holding himself rigid with the effort of not making this decision for her. Ceres, prepare the declaration. Old form, old language. Already drafting it in my head, Ceres said and left. They were alone. You chose 300 strangers over the satisfaction of watching me crush an enemy, Cales said. I chose not to be the reason children lose their parents. He crossed the room and stood in front of her. His hand came up and cupped the side of her face, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw. I was going to wait, he said. I was going to ask properly. on the 4th day. It's the 4th day. I know. He leaned down until his forehead touched hers. Elara. Bloodkeeper. Wolf of silver and growing things. Will you let me mark you, not because of Corvain, not because of the old law, because I have loved you, since a tree wrote my name in your blood, and I will love you until the last root rots, and the last stone crumbles, and the wolves forget the moon. You rehearsed that. For 3 days. She tilted her chin up and kissed him. It was their first real kiss, and it tasted like mint tea and pine sap, and the particular sweetness of a man who has been holding himself back for 2 weeks and has just been told he doesn't have to anymore. His arms went around her, and hers went around his neck, and the grove outside the window exploded into bloom. Every tree producing flowers at once, white and fragrant, releasing a scent that drifted through the fortress and into the mountains, and made every wolf within 10 miles lift their head and howl. The sovereignty declaration was read at dawn in the courtyard grove in the old language by Ceres, who turned out to have a voice like a cathedral bell when she used it. Corvain's envoy, a thin-lipped female with calculating eyes, stood at the edge of the grove and listened. Behind her, a dozen Duskfang warriors shifted uneasily because the grove was doing things. The trees were moving. Not the subtle growth that Elara's blood usually prompted. Active movement, branches shifting position, roots lifting and resettling. The central tree's trunk had developed patterns in its bark that looked like eyes. Elara stood at the base of the central tree in a dress the color of forest moss, her hair washed and brushed and falling to her waist, and she placed both hands on the trunk and said the words that Ceres had taught her. I bind myself to this land. I am its keeper, and it is my ward. My blood feeds its roots. Its roots guard my bones. I name the alpha of this territory as my shield, and any wolf who challenges his claim over me challenges the earth itself. The ground shook, not metaphorically. The actual ground shook. The flagstones cracked. Roots erupted from the earth throughout the courtyard, thick and powerful, lifting the paving stones and weaving through them like fingers threading through fabric. The grove expanded by 30 feet in every direction. A wall of thorns, thick and sharp and alive, pushed up from the soil around the perimeter of the courtyard, growing 12 feet in the time it took to draw a breath. The Duskfang warriors backed away. The envoy stood her ground, but her hands were shaking. Kale stepped forward. He placed his hand on the trunk beside Elara's. I accept the keeper's bond. This land is mine. Its keeper is mine. Challenge us, and you challenge the soil you stand on. The envoy turned and left without a word. Her warriors followed. They were running by the time they reached the gate. Ceres watched them go. I think that went well, she said. Kales looked at Elara. She looked at him. The thorn wall around the courtyard was already producing flowers, white and sharp-smelling, and through it they could see the mountains and the pines and the sky turning pink with dawn. The marking, Elara said, tonight. His eyes went gold. The marking ceremony in the Ironmore Dominion was traditionally a public affair. The Alpha and his mate stood before the pack. Vows were exchanged in the old language, and the bite was given on the juncture of neck and shoulder, where the bond would root deepest, and the mark would be visible to all. Kales had offered to do it privately, just the two of them in the grove. Elara had considered it. For about 3 seconds. No, she said. I spent 18 years being invisible. I want them to see. So the pack gathered. 300 Ironmore wolves assembled in the courtyard grove under a canopy of ashwood branches that had arranged themselves, without anyone asking, into an arch above the central tree. Lanterns hung from the branches, casting warm light that made the bark glow gold and the leaves shimmer silver. The air smelled like the white flowers that the trees had been producing non-stop since the kiss, sweet and clean and slightly wild, like honeysuckle after rain. Elara walked through the arch in the green dress, her hair loose, her feet bare on the earth, and every scar on her arms was visible, and she did not cover them. Cales waited at the central tree. He wore black. He always wore black. But someone, probably Ceres, had pinned a sprig of ashwood leaves to his collar, and the small tender detail against the severity of his usual appearance made Elara's eyes sting. The ceremony was brief. In the old language, Ceres spoke the binding words. In the old language, Cales and Elara repeated them. The pack listened in a silence that was not empty, but full the kind of silence that holds its breath. Flesh to flesh, Ceres said, root to root, blood to blood. From this mark forward, no power under the moon shall sever what the earth has joined. Cales looked at Elara. His eyes were amber, warm and steady, and absolutely certain. "Ready?" he whispered. "Since the greenhouse." His mouth curved. Then he bent to her neck, his lips brushing the skin at the juncture of her shoulder, warm and soft. And she felt his breath and his hesitation, the last moment of restraint from a man who had been restraining himself since the moment he walked through a greenhouse door and smelled yarrow and blood. He bit. The pain was sharp and sweet and brief, like the first cut on the ashwood, like the sting of a needle threaded with something that heals. She felt the bond lock into place, not like a chain, like a root, like the root that had been growing between them since the tree wrote his name, finally reaching deep enough to hold. The pack howled, 300 voices, human and wolf, rising into the night. The trees shuddered and grew. The thorn wall bloomed, and Elara, who had bled for a dying tree for 7 moons, because she believed that nothing should die without someone trying to save it, felt her wolf howl inside her chest, and heard it answered by the enormous black wolf that lived behind the amber eyes of the man holding her. She pressed her face into his neck. He held her so tightly she could feel his heartbeat against her ribs. "Mine," he said. Not possessive, not claiming. Wondering. The way you say mine when you pick up a stone on a beach that fits perfectly in your palm and you cannot believe no one else saw it. "Yours," she said, "and you're mine, and the trees are ours. And your groundskeeper is going to have to find a new profession because I'm not stopping." He laughed into her hair. The grove grew 3 more feet that night. 6 weeks later, Elara stood at the edge of the northern border, where the ancient thorn wall rose 112 feet into the winter sky, its thorns the size of her forearm, its bark dark and weathered and 4 centuries old. Cales stood beside her. The wall was dying, not quickly, not dramatically, but the leaves were yellowing and the thorns were softening, and in places the bark had begun to grey and crack in a way that Elara recognized from 3 years of watching the ashwood at grey mist. "How long?" she asked Ceres, who stood behind them with a survey team. "At this rate, 2 years. Maybe less." Elara looked at the wall. 112 feet of living wood grown by a woman who had been dead for 4 centuries, protecting a territory of thousands. She looked at her hands. She looked at Kyle's. "I'm going to need more than a cut," she said. "No." His voice was immediate, flat. The alpha voice, the one that made pack wolves lower their eyes. She didn't lower her eyes. The last bloodkeeper grew this wall and maintained it for her entire life. She fed it regularly, not drops, enough to sustain 100 miles of living barrier. I will not let you bleed yourself to maintain a wall. It's not just a wall. It's the border. It protects your people, our people. His jaw tightened. She watched the familiar flex and release. There has to be another way. There is. She took his hand and pressed it against the old bark. Feel. He went still. She watched his expression shift as he felt what she felt, the fading pulse of the wall, its roots going dry, its heartwood hardening toward death. It doesn't just need blood, she said. It needs the bond. The original keeper grew it with bonded blood. Alpha and keeper together. Your blood and mine. My blood. Your blood feeds the strength. Mine feeds the growth. Together they feed the bond between the wall and the land. That's why it lasted 4 centuries. It wasn't just her blood. It was their blood. Bonded. He looked at her for a long time. The winter wind blew between them, carrying the smell of snow and pine and the fading sweetness of the thorn wall's last flowers. How much? He asked. A cut each. Once a moon. The wall will do the rest. He pulled a knife from his belt, a simple blade, unadorned the kind a soldier carries. He drew it across his palm without flinching. She did the same with the small blade she kept in her apron pocket. They pressed their bleeding hands against the bark side by side. The wall came alive. It surged. Green fire ran through the wood, racing along the bark in veins of light, and new thorns burst from the surface, sharp and red-tipped, and the leaves went from yellow to deep green in a wave that rolled along the entire length of the wall, like a ripple across water. Roots thickened. Bark hardened. The wall grew 3 feet taller, and the ground shook, and in Thornhall, 10 miles south, the grove in the courtyard burst into bloom, and every wolf in the fortress lifted their head and felt it. The bond, the land, the blood. All one thing. Ceres watched with her arms crossed, and her grey eyes wide. I need a drink, she said. Cales looked at Elara. Blood dripped from both their palms, meeting on the bark between their hands, and sinking into the wood, into the wall, into the earth, into the root system that connected every living thing in the Ironmore territory, the grove, the trees, the wall, the mountains, the rivers, the soil. Once a moon, he said. Once a moon. He laced his bleeding fingers through hers. Their blood mixed on their skin, and where it dripped onto the ground, small shoots pushed through the frozen earth, pale and green, and reaching for the light. Elara planted an ashwood sapling in the courtyard grove on the spring equinox. Not from a seed, from a cutting she'd taken from the central tree, which had grown so large its upper branches now arched over the rooftops of the eastern wing. She'd rooted the cutting in a clay pot on the windowsill of the room that was no longer hers alone. The room with the green coverlet and the wolf-head fountain that was now entirely tree. The room where Cales slept beside her every night, with one arm over her waist and his face pressed into her hair. The sapling was small, a foot tall maybe, thin and pale and trembling in the spring wind. She dug the hole with her hands, feeling the earth cold and gritty under her nails, and placed the sapling in it, and packed the soil around its base. She did not bleed for it. She did not need to. The roots of the grove were already reaching for it, already threading through the soil toward this new piece of themselves, already pulling it into the network that ran beneath the fortress, and out into the mountains, and along the thorn wall, and into the bones of the land. Cales crouched beside her. He was dirty. They'd been working in the grove all morning, clearing dead branches, which was absurd, because the grove never produced dead branches, and they both knew the real reason they were there was because they liked being in the grove together, liked the way the trees leaned toward them when they were close, liked the way the bark hummed a low note that they could feel in their chests. "It's small," he said, looking at the sapling. "Everything starts small." He looked at her. She looked at him. The spring light filtered through the canopy and made dappled patterns on his scarred face, and for a moment he was not the Alpha King of the Ironmore Dominion, not the man who had threatened to dissolve a pack charter and used a neighboring Alpha's spine coat rack metaphor and measured her wrist in a greenhouse. He was just Kale's, dirty knees, amber eyes, a man watching a woman plant a tree. Elara. The healers confirmed this morning. Her hands went still in the soil. Confirmed what? He didn't answer. He just looked at her, and his expression was the one she'd seen on the wall at 4 a.m, the one from the courtyard, when the grove grew, the one from the marking ceremony, when he'd whispered mine. Terror and wonder braided together 2 roots from the same tree. She placed her hand on her stomach. "Oh," she said. "Yeah." "How long?" 6 weeks, maybe 7. They said they could hear a heartbeat. She sat back on her heels in the dirt beside the sapling. The grove around them was silent. Then it wasn't silent. Every tree produced a sound, a low resonant hum, like a chord played on an instrument made of wood and earth and living green, and the ground beneath them warmed, and the sapling she'd just planted grew an inch. "The trees know," she said. "The trees always know." She started laughing, then crying, then both the way you do when your body can't decide which response is adequate for the size of what's happening. He sat down in the dirt beside her and pulled her against his chest, and they sat like that, muddy and crying and laughing, while the grove sang and the sapling grew, and somewhere on the northern border the thorn wall produced a single new flower, white and sharp, and smelling like the future. On a Tuesday in late autumn, in a fortress wrapped in living wood, in a room where the walls were threaded with roots that pulsed in time. With 2 heartbeats, a girl who had once slept in a potting shed sat in a rocking chair that an Alpha King had built himself badly from the fallen branches of an ashwood grove. The chair creaked. One leg was shorter than the others. The armrest on the left side was slightly crooked. "I measured everything 3 times, Kale said from the doorway, genuinely wounded. "You can measure a woman's wrist circumference from a single handhold, but you can't level a chair. These are different skill sets." In her arms the baby slept, a girl dark-haired like her father, with her mother's pale skin and eyes that were at 3 weeks old, already showing flecks of amber and green, as if they couldn't decide which parent to favor. Outside the window the courtyard grove shifted in the wind. The central tree, the one that had started as bark growing over a wolf-head fountain, was now the largest ashwood in recorded history. Its roots ran beneath the fortress, beneath the mountains connecting to the thorn wall on the northern border, and to dozens of saplings that Elara had planted throughout the territory. The network of living wood pulsed with the bond, with blood, with the quiet, constant hum of something ancient and patient that had been waiting 400 years for the right woman to bleed for a dying tree. Kales crossed the room and crouched beside the crooked chair. He looked at his daughter. He looked at his mate. He reached up and tucked a strand of hair behind Elara's ear with the same careful gentleness he'd used in a greenhouse 300 miles south and a lifetime ago. "She has your nose," he said. "She has your jaw. Poor kid. She'll grow into it." He leaned forward and pressed his forehead against Elara's temple. His hand rested on the arm of the chair, the crooked one, and beneath his palm the wood was warm. From the courtyard came the sound of leaves in wind. From the mountains came the sound of wolves running howling alive. From the thorn wall 100 miles north came the deep, slow pulse of 400-year-old roots renewed by bonded blood. And from somewhere inside the fortress, Ceres's voice telling a maintenance worker that they could not trim the roots growing through the kitchen floor. And yes, she was aware the dishwasher no longer worked, and perhaps he should take it up with the blood keeper, who was currently occupied with something more important than his dishwasher. The baby stirred. Her small hand, impossibly small, curled around Cales's finger. He went very still. The chair creaked. The roots hummed. The grove grew.